The world dissolved into a crimson explosion on June 28, 1973, when a man named Mohamed Boudia was reduced to metallic shrapnel in his Parisian Renault R16. It was 11 a.m. on a deceptively clear morning in the City of Lights. The street, Rue des Fossés Saint-Bernard, hummed with the typical Parisian weekday energy. A baker, his apron dusted with flour, was arranging croissants in the window of a shop across the street. A young couple, arms entwined, strolled past, lost in conversation. Boudia, oblivious to the meticulously laid trap, slipped into the driver's seat of his drab grey car. The familiar scent of leather and stale cigarettes filled the air. He turned the key. The instant his body settled against the worn leather, a hidden pressure-activated device beneath the seat detonated. A blinding flash, a deafening roar, and then the world fractured. Metal shards, like teeth of a ravenous beast, tore through the car's frame and Boudia's body. His world became a chaotic dance of pain and darkness, the scent of burning rubber and gasoline replacing the mundane smells of the morning. His final thoughts, if any, were lost in the instant obliteration. 17 minutes later, the first of the French police arrived, their sirens slicing through the remnants of the explosion. The scene was a grotesque tableau of twisted metal and shattered glass. Officers, their faces grim, began the meticulous task of documenting the carnage. They photographed the wreckage from every angle, each shard of metal, each speck of blood, becoming a vital piece of the puzzle. The initial assessment pointed towards a crude, prematurely detonated bomb. But the forensic analysis revealed something far more sophisticated. The device, cleverly concealed, had been designed and planted with precision, the work of professionals. The Mossad had executed its target. Boudia, the head of European operations for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He'd been a ghost, a master of disguise, vanishing into thin air when necessary. He'd lived a life of calculated risk, changing residences constantly, donning elaborate disguises to evade surveillance. He'd once escaped an apartment dressed as an elderly woman, a trick that had fooled even the most persistent tales. Yet, he'd clung to a single, fatal habit. He drove the same car, that unassuming Renault R16 with the Parisian license plate. The Mossad called it the capture point, the operational weakness that allowed for the successful targeted strike. The air in the Mossad's Tel Aviv headquarters crackled with a low-voltage energy of satisfaction. The hunt, the meticulous planning, the patience, all had culminated in this precise execution. The files on Boudia, once a sprawling web of potential threats, were being closed. But the victory was fleeting. The wheels were already in motion on the other side of the world in the shadow. The next stage in this deadly game had already begun. The death of Boudia was merely a spark, the start of an endless cycle of violence. Revenge, like a malignant seed, had already been sown. The bullet, meant to end Joseph Seif's life, ricocheted off the unforgiving curve of his dental prosthesis, the sound a sickening crack in the opulent silence of his London home. Carlos, the young Venezuelan, stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the smoking barrel of his Tokarev pistol inches from the businessman's face. The failure hung heavy in the air, a palpable dread that quickly turned to icy panic. He was not supposed to fail. The scent of expensive polish and old money clung to the air in Seif's lavish bathroom. Water still dripped from the tap in the porcelain sink, a counterpoint to the thudding in Carlos's chest. He'd rehearsed this meticulously, the plan a ballet of calculated movements, a swift entry, the silencing of the housekeeper, the brutal execution. Now it was a shambles. He'd barged in, a whirlwind of aggression only to be thwarted by a twist of fate, the unpredictable curve of a dental plate. He tasted bile, his throat constricted with a fear he'd never known. The housekeeper, a frightened blur of a woman, had witnessed everything, her eyes wide with terror. He'd been too late to silence her, her screams sure to bring the police and the world crashing down. He risked a glance at Seif, slumped against the wall, a crimson smear blooming across his cheek where the bullet had grazed. Unmoving, unconscious. Was he dead? Carlos couldn't be sure, the adrenaline blurring the edges of his vision. He needed to get out, to vanish into the London night before the law could catch him. His mind raced, calculating escape routes, weighing risks, the plan he'd meticulously crafted now a chaotic jumble in his mind. He knew every detail of CF's routine, the precise timing of his visits to the Federation offices, the route he took. Every detail was carefully studied. He, Carlos, had become an expert in CF's life, a silent stalker, waiting for the perfect moment. His mission was revenge, a debt owed to the memory of Boudia, the fallen commander. His orders, direct and unyielding: eliminate CF, a key figure in the Zionist machine. He fumbled with the pistol, trying to chamber another round, his hands slick with sweat. The weapon jammed. Frustration, cold and sharp, cut through his fear. He'd spent weeks, months even, perfecting this, the language, the accents, the disguise. He'd transformed himself into a wealthy Latin American playboy, a creature of parties and fleeting romances, a mask to hide the deadly purpose beneath. Now, it had all unraveled. He cursed under his breath, the words a jumble of Spanish and a barely understood English. The sound of sirens, distant but growing closer, sliced through the tense quiet. Time was running out. He had to leave. He took one last, desperate look at CF, his face a mask of crumpled flesh. Another shot would guarantee his target's death, but the jammed gun, he couldn't risk it. Turning sharply, Carlos fled the house, leaving behind the chilling stench of gunpowder and the haunting echo of a plan gone horribly, terribly wrong. He dashed out the front door and disappeared into the night. The image of CF's face burned into his retinas. He was a hunted man, the failure cementing his fate. The sharp sting of the Jordanian sun on his neck was the last thing Ilich Ramirez Sanchez felt before plunging headfirst into a world of violence. The scream of the training camp rang in his ears, a chilling echo of the man he was becoming. The boy, born into privilege in Caracas, was a universe away from this dusty training ground in the Jordanian desert. His father, a staunch Marxist lawyer, had named him after Lenin, a testament to the family's fervent ideology. His childhood was one of comfort, filled with books, heated political debates around the dinner table, and the heady scent of his mother's perfume. But the seed of rebellion, of a life beyond the familiar, was already taking root. It germinated in his soul and turned into a tree. His transformation began in 1966, when, barely 17, Ilich traveled to Moscow. The stark, grey city, a world away from the vibrant chaos of Venezuela, was a revelation. He enrolled at the Patrice Lumumba University, a breeding ground for young revolutionaries from the Third World. It was there, amidst the clatter of Russian and the hushed whispers of dissent, that he encountered the Palestinian students. Their tales of the struggle against Israeli occupation ignited a fire within him. He was a perfect fit for a narrative, and it was perfect for him. They spoke of land stolen, of families displaced, of a constant state of war. Their pain was visceral, their rage palpable. Ilich, a young man searching for purpose, found it in their cause. One man, Mohamed Boudia, particularly captivated him. Boudia, a veteran of the Algerian War of Independence, a talented playwright, and a seasoned operative of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, in Europe, was a walking embodiment of revolutionary fervor. Boudia saw in Ilich a malleable idealism, a willingness to sacrifice, a thirst for action. Boudia was everything and nothing. He was chaos and the order of a new life. He was a myth. The summer of 1970 found Ilich, now calling himself Carlos, leaving Moscow for Jordan. He was no longer just a privileged son of a revolutionary, but a recruit. The training camp was brutal, a crash course in survival and violence. Days were spent learning guerrilla tactics, the art of ambush, the construction of IEDs, the manipulation of explosives. Nights were filled with the hushed plotting of operations, the clandestine sharing of intelligence, and the growing bond between men who had sworn to die for a cause. He learned to disassemble and reassemble an AK-47 blindfolded, his fingers now calloused, his body hardened. He learned to see the world through a scope, to measure life and death in the crosshairs. But even in the midst of this radical transformation, the echoes of his past, the scent of his mother's perfume, the warmth of his father's embrace, never truly faded. They lingered, ghosts in the machine of his becoming, memories of everything he was leaving behind. Then came Black September, The Jordanian army, seeking to crush the growing power of the Palestinian organizations, turned on their former allies. Carlos, along with many others, was forced to flee the chaos, heading for London. A new city, a new life, a new target. The desert dust, the sweat, the adrenaline, all of it faded. But the war, the cause, the thirst for vengeance, never would. It was his new home. The air in Paris crackled with the premonition of violence, a tension Carlos both craved and controlled. He was a master puppeteer, and the city, a stage for his intricate dance of death. He was meticulously building his empire. The Mossad, as he knew, were already circling like vultures, but for now the play was his. His immediate goal, establish a solid infrastructure, a network that would allow his operations to flourish. Safe houses, communication channels, and a list of targets. That's what he needed. He sat in a dimly lit café near the Champs-Élysées, the aroma of strong coffee and Gauloise's cigarettes filling his lungs. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but the world outside felt distant, muted. He tapped a slender finger against a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with meticulous notes in a combination of Cyrillic Spanish and coded symbols only he and a select few understood. A young woman with fiery red hair and startling green eyes, Marie-Claire, his current lover, and a valuable asset in his clandestine work, sat across from him, sipping her café au lait. Her presence was both a distraction and an anchor, a reminder of the normalcy he craved even as he reveled in the chaos. His gaze flickered over the lists he'd compiled. Prominent politicians, influential businessmen, prominent figures in Jewish communities. Names meticulously researched, addresses meticulously noted, vulnerabilities meticulously exploited. This was not a game of chance. This was a calculated strike, each target chosen for maximum impact and minimal collateral damage, a detail of his methodology that set him apart. He knew the Mossad would be watching, their eyes probably trained on every shadow he cast, but he was prepared. He had anticipated their tactics. He was the architect of his own destruction, but he would make sure the building burned brightly before crumbling. He had learned a lot from Boudia, the meticulous planning, the patience, the understanding of human frailties. He was now implementing that knowledge, adding his own flair. He began visiting a shop on the outskirts of the city, a seemingly innocuous establishment that specialized in theatrical props. He spent hours there, meticulously examining fake beards, mustaches, wigs, and various disguises. He needed to be invisible, a ghost in the machine. He had to be able to blend in anywhere. He met with Michel Moukarbal, a young Lebanese man with intense eyes, a fire in his belly that mirrored Carlos's own. Moukarbal, or Tikin as he was known, was a gifted artist with a keen eye for detail. They spent long nights together, poring over maps, planning operations, discussing the intricacies of their shared mission. Their headquarters was an unassuming apartment in a nondescript building. Here, they built explosives, crafted false identities, and planned their next moves. The apartment was filled with an organized chaos. The air smelled of chemicals and gunpowder. On the walls, meticulously detailed charts and maps showed their plans, the network growing bigger every day. Carlos, the embodiment of a chameleon, was slowly preparing his plan. Each step carefully calculated, each action a meticulous dance towards an unknown end. He knew that the stakes were higher, but the exhilaration, the thrill of the hunt, was unmatched. The time for the symphony of terror was fast approaching. The thunder of the explosions echoed through the Parisian night, shattering glass and ripping through metal. Yet Carlos, somewhere in the city's labyrinthine alleys, smiled, the taste of victory and the scent of cordite mingling on his breath. The first bombs detonated at precisely 2 a.m., rocking 3 French newspapers accused of pro-Israel bias, the tremors shaking the foundations of their offices. He'd orchestrated this symphony of destruction, choosing the hour with precision, ensuring that the only witnesses would be the indifferent shadows and the watchful eyes of the intelligence agencies. This wasn't about killing, it was about broadcasting a message, a declaration of intent, a testament to his capabilities. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of burnt paper and the lingering tang of explosives. He'd watched the preparations with a detached calm, the meticulous planning, the careful selection of targets. His mind, always a whirlwind of calculations and strategies, was now focused on the execution. Each location, each explosive charge, was a stroke of his strategic brush. This was his art, a canvas of chaos painted with the brushstrokes of revenge and ideological fervor. He felt the familiar thrill coursing through him, the adrenaline that fueled his every move, the certainty that he was a force to be reckoned with. But amidst the controlled mayhem, the plan for Maison de la Radio went awry. The bomb failed to detonate, a glitch in the carefully constructed sequence, a momentary stumble in his otherwise flawless performance. Frustration flickered within him, quickly extinguished by the need to maintain control. He had to think fast, to adapt, to ensure that the mission didn't become a complete failure. He couldn't afford a single misstep. His reputation and the very survival of his operation depended on it. He imagined the reactions of the Mossad, the DST, the men in dark suits who hunted him relentlessly, poring over the wreckage, piecing together the fragments of his actions. They would be relentless in their pursuit, analyzing every detail, every connection, every potential slip-up. He pictured their frustration, their slow, methodical unraveling of the intricate web he had spun around himself. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, a deadly dance with forces that sought his destruction. He pictured the faces of his men, Muqabal, who was his second in command, his loyal lieutenants, their resolve tested in the face of danger. He hoped they were safe, that they'd managed to disappear into the Parisian night, melting back into the shadows. He knew they trusted him with their lives, and he felt the weight of that responsibility pressing upon him. It was a burden he carried willingly, the price of command in the clandestine world he had chosen. Carlos moved from alley to alley, his senses heightened, his mind racing. He anticipated the rush of sirens, the swarm of police, the inevitable manhunt. He melted into the darkness, blending with the cityscape, a phantom moving through the heart of the city, a predator always ahead of the pack. The night was his cloak, the shadows his allies, and the city, a vast, unforgiving hunting ground where he was always at play. The acrid smell of burnt rubber and jet fuel choked the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Gunfire crackled, a staccato rhythm against the piercing screams echoing from the terminal. Carlos, face grim under the harsh glare of floodlights, found himself trapped in a chaotic ballet of violence at Orly Airport. The first attempt, days before, had been a clumsy failure. This time, however, the team was more prepared. Grenades had been fired, aimed at El Al aircraft, but the security was tighter, the response swifter. Chaos erupted. Passengers dove for cover, their faces etched with terror. Security personnel, caught off guard, scrambled for cover. Carlos, ever the strategist, saw the opening. He barked orders in a mixture of Spanish and Arabic, his voice barely audible over the din. The plan was simple: seize hostages, demand a plane to a safe haven. He felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the familiar thrill of the hunt. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in a shattered window, the eyes cold and focused, a predator sizing up its prey. He'd traded his tailored suit for a combat jacket, but the air of controlled elegance remained, a stark contrast to the surrounding pandemonium. He moved with a practiced grace, weaving through the panicked crowd, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing threats. The initial assault had been successful. They had taken control of a portion of the terminal. Now it was a waiting game. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the escalating tension and the shouts of negotiators. Carlos knew the French authorities would eventually come for them. He pictured Poniatowski, the Minister of Interior, a man of ruthless efficiency, no doubt already on site coordinating the operation. He imagined the cold calculation behind the man's eyes. He watched the faces of his hostages, a cross-section of humanity. Fear was the common denominator, a universal language. He could see it in the trembling hands, the wide, terrified eyes. He felt a flicker of something akin to pity, quickly suppressed. Emotions were a weakness, a luxury he couldn't afford. This was a game of power, a brutal dance. He was the conductor, and they were the instruments. He had a growing sense that something was wrong, an unshakable feeling of unease that crawled up his spine. The negotiators were dragging the negotiations. Their demands were being met, but still, no plane. The French were playing a dangerous game. Were they stalling for time? Were they planning a raid? As the night wore on, the tension in the terminal became almost unbearable. The floodlights cast long, dancing shadows, distorting shapes, feeding the growing paranoia. His carefully constructed plan was on the verge of collapsing. He felt a cold dread grip him, a certainty that something had shifted, that he was walking into a trap. And as the dawn began to break, painting the sky in pale shades of grey, he knew he had to get out. He had to vanish, leaving behind the carnage and the hostages. His escape, carefully planned, was a masterful display of audacity, a disappearing act into the shadows of the Parisian night. The air in Beirut was thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and impending doom when a man named Michel Moukarbal, known as Tikin, made a fatal error, leading to the collapse of a network that was the foundation of Carlos's European operations. He neglected the simplest rule of his trade, operational security. He was picked up by the Lebanese police, and their interrogation, a brutal tapestry of threats and physical persuasion, lasted 24 agonizing hours. Under duress, a ledger surfaced. Its pages, filled with coded addresses and cryptic notations, were a roadmap to Carlos's European network, its hidden arteries and veins exposed. The Lebanese authorities, realizing the magnitude of their find, immediately alerted the French DST, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, France's domestic counterintelligence agency. The DST, smelling blood, placed Moukarbal under electronic surveillance. The goal wasn't immediate arrest. It was to unravel the entire web, to identify every spider in the jackal's web before the trap was sprung. Back in Paris, Moukarbal was allowed to walk free from the airport. It was a calculated gamble, a leash on a dangerous dog. Agents shadowed him, following his movements like patient shadows. A dance of deception played out on the city's bustling streets. They witnessed meetings in cafes, observed clandestine exchanges, and photographed every contact, their cameras capturing fleeting moments of association. The net tightened slowly, a noose drawn around a phantom. The surveillance led them to a narrow, forgotten street behind the Sorbonne University, the Rue de la Tuileries. It was a quiet lane, a haven from the city's roar, where old buildings leaned against each other and secrets whispered in the shadows. Here, agents observed Moukarbal meeting with an unknown man, a figure wearing dark sunglasses that obscured his eyes, hinting at a world of anonymity. The DST agents discreetly captured the meeting from a nearby cafe. The photographic evidence was damning, a piece of a puzzle, and it confirmed their suspicions. Moukarbal was a critical link, and the network was real. Moukarbal was finally taken into formal custody. He was questioned for 5 long days. The DST interrogators, skilled in the art of extracting information, applied pressure, weaving a tapestry of psychological tactics and threats. They showed him the photographs, confronted him with the evidence. He caved, revealing the details of Carlos's operations. His world began to crumble. The intelligence gathered from Moukarbal confirmed the suspicions the Mossad had meticulously gathered over the years. This intelligence, coupled with Moukarbal's confessions, gave the DST the information they needed to act. The target was identified, the network mapped, the hunt was on. Carlos's Beretta spat fire, the screams a cacophony against the sudden silence of the cramped Parisian apartment. The acrid smell of gunpowder choked the air, mixing with the scent of cheap wine and the lingering perfume of the departing guests. The apartment at 93 Rue des Tourelles, a modest flat on a side street off the Sorbonne, had been hosting a farewell party. A group of Colombians were sending off a friend back to Venezuela. Soft guitar music had been playing, conversations flowed easily, and the air buzzed with laughter. Then the photograph in the hand of Commissaire Jean Héran, a picture of Carlos from a cafe earlier that day, brought the world crashing down. The jovial atmosphere shattered. Carlos, his dark eyes narrowed behind the same sunglasses he wore in the photo, had asked for permission to use the bathroom. Herons, a seasoned detective, had granted the request without a second thought, but the bathroom, as it turned out, held a secret. Now Carlos, a man known to intelligence agencies across the globe, stood in the doorway, his beretta in his hand, a cold, ruthless glint in his eyes. Raymond, the first man to fall, crumpled to the floor, a startled look frozen on his face. The impact of the bullets had ripped through him, and the room was rapidly filling with the metallic tang of blood. The second shot caught Jean Donatini, the second inspector. He let out a strangled cry before slumping down next to his partner. Carlos, his face now a mask of grim determination, moved with a practiced efficiency. He saw Michel Moukarbal, the man who knew too much, the man who had been caught and interrogated, the man who had led them here. Carlos didn't hesitate. He raised the gun, aimed, and pulled the trigger again. The room erupted into chaos. The remaining guests, paralyzed with fear, scrambled for cover behind the furniture. Their faces were a blur of terror, their screams now piercing the silence. Herons, though gravely wounded, clawed at his sidearm, but it was too late. Carlos, with the cold efficiency of a predator, turned and vanished into the labyrinthine streets of the Latin Quarter. The world seemed to spin as the reality of the situation sunk in. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, the scent of death hanging heavy in the air. The music stopped. The laughter was replaced by screams. The Colombians, their lives forever altered by the violence, tried to comprehend the scene of utter devastation before them. The party had turned into a slaughterhouse. Herons, his breath coming in ragged gasps, tried to reach for the phone to call for help. Donatini lay still, his face contorted in a silent scream. Raymond was gone. Moukarbal lay lifeless, a single red stain blossoming on his white shirt. The escape was swift, almost ghostly, and now the silence of the city's heart, a chilling reminder of the violence. The photograph of the dead men stared back at him from the newspaper, a stark testament to the chaos he'd unleashed, the blood mingling on the floor like a morbid artwork. The world now knew him as Carlos the Jackal. The press had painted him as a merciless killer, a phantom haunting the shadows of international intrigue. But beneath the bravado, a cold calculation took root. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that this notoriety was a double-edged sword. It brought power, yes, but also a relentless spotlight, a target painted on his back by every intelligence agency in the world. He paced his Algiers safe house, the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap coffee clinging to the air. The walls were lined with maps, scribbled with names and addresses, the intricate web of his operations. He felt a thrill of invincibility, a perverse satisfaction in the fear he inspired. The phone buzzed, a coded signal he instantly recognized. It was Wadi Haddad, his voice when he finally spoke, a low growl laced with barely concealed fury. The botched raid in Paris had sent tremors through the PFLP, shaking their carefully constructed infrastructure. Carlos was dismissed as reckless, uncontrollable. The accusations stung, but he knew Haddad's anger masked a deeper reality. The PFLP needed him. He had become a brand, a symbol of defiance against the West. He was invaluable, and he knew it. He began to plan his response, to build a network of support that extended far beyond the constraints of the PFLP. He saw a landscape of opportunity to exploit the rivalries, the greed, the ambitions of nations hungry for power. He sought the protection of those who could guarantee his safety, the regimes that whispered promises of sanctuary in the shadows. He looked to the distant shores of Libya, where Gaddafi's fiery rhetoric echoed his own revolutionary fervor. He courted the Syrian regime, where the whispers of war could bring him closer to his goals, and to the potential for funding and safe harbor. He knew the risk of this was great, that it would require shifting alliances, but he relished the challenge. His mind was a forge, hammering out strategies, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He needed money, weapons, safe passage. He needed skilled operatives, people who could be trusted, whose loyalty could not be bought. The world had turned upside down, the rules rewritten with each passing operation. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a king, commanding an army of the shadows. But he also understood this new game required calculated risks, the necessity of a cold detachment, and the ability to adapt to the shifting sands of global politics. He was starting to build his own organization. He was reaching for something new, something that would cement his legacy. The notoriety had given him freedom, a chance to set his own terms, to become a legend. He knew the hunt for him would intensify, the pressure relentless, but he also believed that he could outmaneuver them all. He was Carlos, the jackal, and his story was far from over. The world held its breath as shots echoed through the opulent halls of the OPEC headquarters in Vienna, the chilling sound a prelude to a day of terror. It was December 21st, 1975, a crisp Sunday morning, and the elite of the global oil industry had gathered for a routine meeting. But routine was the last thing on anyone's mind, as Carlos, his face a mask of cold determination, led his team of 6 into the building. The air immediately crackled with tension, the calm replaced by the metallic tang of fear and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He moved with the practiced grace of a predator, his eyes scanning the room, assessing threats, evaluating opportunities. His team, a mix of nationalities, moved with him, armed with Kalashnikovs and grenades, a deadly ballet of violence unfolding in the heart of the conference. Their boots echoed on the polished floors, a rhythmic counterpoint to the panicked screams that erupted as the first shots rang out. Within minutes, the conference room transformed into a scene of utter chaos. Delegates dove under tables, their faces contorted in terror. Security guards caught off guard scrambled for cover, their futile attempts at resistance quickly silenced. Carlos, with a calm born of years of violence, took control. He barked orders in a mixture of French, Arabic, and Spanish, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. He methodically separated the hostages into groups, a chilling assessment of who lived and who might die. The enemies, the Iranians and Saudis, were marked for special treatment. The friends, the remaining delegates, were given a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of survival. Each glance he gave, a moment of consideration before assigning their fate. It was a macabre game of life and death, and Carlos was the ruthless master of ceremonies. The negotiators, representatives of the Austrian government, began their desperate dance with Carlos. They attempted to soothe his demands, to reason with him. But Carlos was unmoved, his resolve as hard as the steel of his weapons. He demanded a plane, freedom, a platform to broadcast his message, a declaration of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. The hours stretched on, heavy with the oppressive weight of fear and uncertainty. The world watched, glued to their television screens, as the crisis unfolded. As the hours passed and negotiations continued, Carlos felt an almost perverse satisfaction at the sheer audacity of his act. He was no longer just a terrorist. He was a symbol, a statement. He was the jackal, and he was dictating terms to the world. He tasted the adrenaline and felt invigorated. The fear of his victims gave him power, fueling his resolve. At precisely 10:22 p.m., the first demand was met. The radio crackled to life, broadcasting a statement, a testament to Carlos's victory. He had not just taken hostages, he had seized the narrative, shaping the world's perception of the conflict. The release of select hostages gave him the bargaining tool he needed as he moved his remaining victims towards the airport. The journey to Argelia, then to Tripoli, was a hazy blur of movement. Negotiations, threats, promises. All a part of the theater of terror, the brutal performance that had become his trademark. Then, finally, he vanished, as if swallowed by the shadows, taking with him a hefty ransom, leaving behind a world that would never forget the day the jackal struck at the heart of the oil-rich world. The operation in Vienna had catapulted Carlos to the status of the world's most wanted man. The scent of stale coffee and cheap cigarettes hung thick in the air of the Tel Aviv safe house, a constant companion to the low hum of activity. The air conditioning, perpetually struggling against the humid Israeli heat, did little to dispel the tension. It was March of 1976, and the hunt for Carlos the Jackal was reaching a fever pitch. A high-resolution photograph of a Parisian café, Le Chat Noir, a target of the French intelligence, was pinned to a corkboard. It was a still life of terror. Tables and chairs, the faded red awning, and 2 figures huddled in a corner, one of them unmistakably Carlos. The Mossad, under the guise of an innocuous trading company, had turned this nondescript building into a nerve center, a labyrinth of wires, maps, and intel. Agents moved like shadows, their faces etched with a grim determination, poring over stacks of intercepted communications, surveillance reports, and financial records. This wasn't a manhunt. It was a meticulous archaeological dig, unearthing the Jackal's world brick by brick, contact by contact. Their goal wasn't just Carlos, it was to dismantle the entire infrastructure that fueled his deadly operations. The operation was led by a seasoned agent, known only as Ari, his face weathered by years spent in the shadows. He ran his hand over the photograph of the cafe, his eyes scanning every detail, every shadow. "This is not just about catching Carlos," he muttered to himself, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "It's about cutting off the head of the serpent and then burning the body to ashes." The walls of the safe house were plastered with maps, crisscrossed with colored pins and connected by threads, illustrating the complex network of Carlos's operations. The blue pins represented safe houses, the red pins marked arms caches, the green ones signified money laundering operations. Each pin, each thread was a testament to the relentless pursuit. Every member of Carlos's circle, from the lowliest courier to the highest-ranking co-conspirator, was catalogued in meticulous detail. Every girlfriend was scrutinized, her family background dissected, her movements tracked. Every apartment used as a safe house was identified, its floor plan meticulously drawn, its occupants observed. Information flowed into Tel Aviv from all corners of the globe. Discreet drops in coffee shops in Vienna, encrypted messages from agents in Damascus, a casual conversation overheard in a bustling market in Beirut. Each scrap of data, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was fed into the maw of the Mossad's analytical machine. Analysts fluent in multiple languages worked around the clock, piecing together the puzzle, sifting through the noise, and hunting for any thread that might unravel the Jackal's web. A young analyst, Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights, pointed to a new entry on the board, a meeting scheduled in Berlin. "We have confirmed reports of a meeting between Carlos and members of the German Red Army faction." Her voice was hushed, almost reverent, as if speaking of a dangerous and mythical creature. "They are discussing financial transfers." Ari nodded, his expression grim. "Carlos is always in need of money. He'll take it from anyone at any cost." The Mossad agents knew they were up against a formidable foe. Carlos was elusive, unpredictable, and ruthless, but they also knew that they had one weapon on their side: patience. They were playing a long game, a game of attrition. They knew that sooner or later the Jackal would make a mistake. He would slip up, he would let his guard down, and when he did, the Mossad would be waiting, ready to pounce. Their relentless pursuit, their painstaking attention to detail, was a slow burn, a fire that would consume the Jackal and his empire of terror. The world wouldn't be safe until they did. The air crackled with the electric tension of the FPLP's disavowal, a death knell echoing in Carlos's ears, leaving him adrift, a lone wolf in a world teeming with potential prey. The letter from Wadad, a curt dismissal, had arrived via a courier in a drab Beirut apartment, the words a cold slap across the face of the burgeoning legend. He, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, the man who'd masterminded Vienna, the man who'd sent shivers down the spines of Western intelligence, was now considered a liability. Too flamboyant, too unpredictable, too much of a loose cannon. The FPLP, with its rigid ideology and focus on strategic goals, couldn't control him anymore. The dismissal was a turning point, a watershed moment. A bitter taste of betrayal swirled in Carlos's mouth. The comfort of the revolutionary family, the shared cause, the collective identity, all ripped away. He was now officially a freelancer. The world, or at least the criminal underworld of global terrorism, was now his oyster. He leaned back in his worn armchair, the damp Beirut air clinging to his skin, his mind racing. This was no setback, but a rebirth. No longer bound by the constraints of the FPLP, he could choose his targets, set his own prices, and build his own empire. The first step was to secure his future. He knew the value of loyalty, and more importantly, the value of those who could deliver. His gaze turned toward his surroundings, his apartment. The sparse furnishings, the faded posters of Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh on the walls, offered scant comfort. He needed resources, manpower, and a new network. one forged in the crucible of his own ambition. He thought of the Syrians, their intelligence services always eager to play a game of shadows with the West, and their need for a skilled operator to sow chaos and instability. Or perhaps the Libyans, flush with oil money and harboring a deep-seated hatred for the Americans and the Israelis. Carlos allowed himself a smirk. He could play them all, work them against each other, carve out his own kingdom in the world of shadows and deceit. His phone rang, a persistent shrill sound. He picked it up. A man's voice, laced with a thick German accent, filled the room. Johannes Weinrich, the former RAF member, eager to prove his worth. They had met briefly months ago, Weinrich and a group of German radicals who were ready to be hired. Now, Weinrich was calling to say that he was ready. Then came Magdalena Kopp, the cold-blooded German woman, a woman of steely eyes and unwavering resolve. They had first met in Paris. Kopp, like Weinrich, was looking for a purpose after leaving the organization. He saw in her a dangerous, loyal accomplice and a perfect partner to share in the spoils. A new team was taking shape, the nucleus of his independent operation. He would recruit others, a web of agents, assassins, bomb makers, and document forgers, a shadow army ready to unleash hell on those who dared to cross his path. His mind envisioned the network, the intricate system of safe houses, false identities, and offshore accounts, stretching across continents, a testament to his ambition and ruthless efficiency. Carlos rose, a predatory glint in his eyes. The FPLP had cast him aside, but their rejection was his liberation. He was free to build his own legend, write his own rules, and carve his name into the annals of history, a name that would forever be synonymous with terror and audacity. He would become a shadow, an enigma, an international mercenary without allegiance, and he would make the world tremble. The screech of tires, a brief glimpse of flashing blue and red, and then silence. That's how it would all end, Carlos knew then, despite the illusion of control. He stood on a rooftop overlooking the Damascus skyline, the humid night air clinging to him like a shroud. Below, the city throbbed with a familiar energy, a cacophony of car horns, distant laughter, and the haunting call to prayer that echoed from minarets across the city. For years, this had been his sanctuary, a fortress against the storm of international pursuit. Syria, under the watchful eye of Hafez al-Assad, had offered him sanctuary, a deal he'd gladly taken. He had in return restrained himself, put the bombs and bullets away, and embraced a life of relative ease, a gilded cage he had grown accustomed to. But the world was changing, a tectonic shift that even he, the self-proclaimed master of chaos, couldn't ignore. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and with it the unwavering support of the Eastern Bloc. The Stasi, the Hungarians, the East Germans, the allies who had provided him with forged passports, safe houses, and logistical support, were gone. Their networks had crumbled, their secrets exposed. The map of his world had been redrawn, and he was no longer at the center. He felt the familiar gnawing unease in his gut, a premonition of impending doom. He smoked a Gauloise's cigarette, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye in the darkness. The scent of jasmine and exhaust fumes swirled around him, a perfume of the Middle East, a land that had both embraced and betrayed him. He could almost taste the fear, the metallic tang of it coating his tongue. The Gulf War, the brutal reality on the news that played in an endless loop on his television, had been the final nail in the coffin. Saddam Hussein, his once valued ally, had invaded Kuwait, and the world had risen in condemnation. The Americans were coming, and the winds of change were blowing toward Damascus. Assad, ever the pragmatist, was beginning to re-evaluate his relationships, sensing the shifting geopolitical sands. The price of protection, once so easily paid, was now becoming exorbitant. He thought of the past, the adrenaline-fueled highs, the explosions, the faces of his enemies, and the cold comfort of comrades, the blood spilled, the lives shattered. Was it all worth it? The question haunted him, a specter in the shadows. He had become a symbol, a legend, the jackal, a name that struck fear into the hearts of men. But at what cost? What had he truly achieved beyond a reputation for violence and a mountain of enemies? He knew he couldn't stay. The pressure was mounting, the whispers of betrayal growing louder. He had to move, find a new sanctuary, a new haven from the relentless pursuit. But where? The world, once his playground, was now closing in. The game, it seemed, was almost over, and the hunter had become the hunted. A cold sweat broke across his brow. He stubbed out his cigarette, the ember extinguished, leaving only the lingering smell of burnt tobacco and the chilling echo of what was to come. He was a creature of the shadows, and the light was fast approaching. The sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital room in Khartoum cast long, unsettling shadows as Carlos felt the needle pierce his skin, the sharp sting a prelude to his undoing. He'd trusted the Sudanese, believed their assurances of safety, but the world was shifting beneath his feet and the ground was giving way. He awoke not to the friendly faces of his hosts, but the cold glare of strangers, the abrupt reality of his capture hitting him like a physical blow. The game was over. The capture, the culmination of decades of pursuit, wasn't a blaze of gunfire, a daring raid, or a heroic act of infiltration. It was a betrayal, a chilling consequence of shifting alliances and the relentless pressure of a world determined to see him brought to justice. For years he had evaded the reach of every intelligence agency, danced between borders, and exploited the vulnerabilities of a world in chaos. He had become a ghost, a phantom, his name a whisper in the corridors of power. But now the phantom was tangible, shackled, and utterly defeated. The hospital room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. The Sudaneses were gone, replaced by the grim-faced men who had ushered him onto the plane. Panic clawed at his throat, a silent scream trapped within. He replayed the events, searching for a misstep, a sign he had missed, a moment where he could have changed the course of events. But the truth was simple. His time had run out. As the plane ascended, leaving the swirling sands of Sudan behind, a wave of despair washed over him. The years of violence, the thrill of the chase, the fleeting moments of triumph, all of it had led to this. The world would see him defeated, a prisoner of a system he had defied for so long. His mind raced, cataloguing the betrayals, the shifting allegiances, the slow erosion of his power. He thought of his network, the scattered remnants of a once formidable organization. He thought of his family, the distant faces he might never see again. The life he built was collapsing around him, a monument to a past now irrevocably lost. He closed his eyes. The image of his captors burned into his memory. The faces were blank, devoid of emotion, their eyes reflecting nothing but cold professionalism. They represented the collective will of nations, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the inevitable consequences of his actions. This was his final act. He had danced on the edge of the abyss for too long, and now he had fallen in. The journey to Paris, the journey to judgment, had begun. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a testament to the fact that even the most cunning and elusive of men could be caught by the long arm of the law. The legend of Carlos, the jackal, would fade into history, a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of the intelligence world. His reign of terror was over, extinguished not by a bullet or a bomb, but by the cold logic of betrayal and the inevitable march of time. His final act. The silence that followed would be deafening,